Picture this. You are floating just below the surface of a warm Florida spring, sunlight bending through the water in long golden ribbons. Ahead of you, something enormous drifts into view, slow, gray, utterly unbothered. A Florida manatee. It weighs close to 1,000 pounds. It moves like it has nowhere urgent to be, and for most of the 20th century, it was vanishing from the earth. This is the story of how a species came back from the edge. And what makes it remarkable isn't just the numbers, though the numbers are stunning. It's the cast of characters who made it happen: researchers, legislators, divers, local fishermen, and, in one of conservation's stranger footnotes, one of the most famous singer-songwriters in American history. But before we get to the comeback, we need to sit with the crisis, because it was bad, really, genuinely, frighteningly bad. The Florida manatee is a subspecies of the West Indian manatee, and it was one of the first creatures listed as endangered when the Federal Endangered Species Act went into effect in 1973. By the mid-1970s, only about 1,000 individuals survived in Florida. 1,000 for an entire subspecies. To put that in perspective, imagine every manatee in the state fitting inside a mid-sized sports stadium with room to spare. By that point, manatee populations had declined drastically due to boat collisions, habitat loss, and entanglement in fishing gear. Of all those threats, the boats were the most visible and the most brutal. Because manatees are generally slow-moving animals, they are unable to move out of the way of rapidly approaching boats. Spinning propellers hit and maim them, and those hits can be lethal. The animals were essentially defenseless against a recreational boating boom that was exploding across Florida's waterways. The evidence of this violence is written on the animals themselves. Research has determined that 96% of adult Florida manatees bear scars from boat strikes, and 1 in 4 has been hit by a boat on 10 or more separate occasions. Think about that. Not once, not twice, 10 times or more. Scientists and conservationists often identify particular manatees by the propeller scars on their backs and tails, each one a record of a near-death encounter with a hull or a spinning blade. And then there was the habitat. The rise of large power plants along Florida's rivers and bays in the 1960s had created pools of warm water discharges that allowed manatees to expand their range. But manatees became dependent on those artificial heat sources for winter survival. Natural seagrass beds, their primary food, were being choked by agricultural runoff and coastal development. The water was getting murkier, the food was disappearing, the boats were multiplying. Scientists watching the data in the early 1970s weren't speculating about extinction. They were watching it unfold in real time. So how do you stop something like that? It turns out you do it layer by layer. You build a legal scaffold, then a cultural one, and then you enforce both of them imperfectly, stubbornly, over decades. The first layer was law. As a marine mammal, the West Indian manatee was protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972. The Endangered Species Act followed in 1973. Then the Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act of 1978 established Florida as a refuge and sanctuary for manatees, protecting them from injury, disturbance, harassment, or harm in the waters of Florida and allowing for enforcement of boat speeds. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission was given the authority to create and adopt manatee protection zone rules under that same act. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were enforceable rules with real teeth, and they set the stage for a system of no-wake zones and slow-speed corridors that would eventually spread across the state. The second layer was cultural, and this is where the story gets genuinely strange. Save the Manatee Club was established in 1981 by former Florida Governor Bob Graham and singer-songwriter Jimmy Buffett. A governor and a rock star sitting in the same room deciding to save a sea cow. In 1981, the two joined forces to establish the Save the Manatee Committee with a mission to educate the public about the presence of manatees in Florida's waters and the threats they faced. Buffett didn't merely lend his name to the cause, he starred in public service announcements, used his concerts to raise funds and awareness, and directed resources toward essential waterway signs to protect manatees from speeding boats. It sounds almost absurd, but here's why it mattered. The manatees' problem wasn't just legal, it was a visibility problem. Most Floridians, and certainly most boaters, had no idea how close these animals were to gone. Buffett had millions of fans. He had a microphone and a platform, and he pointed both of them at a slow, gray, endangered mammal. Under his guidance, the club fought for the creation of manatee sanctuaries, boat speed regulations, and habitat protections. Awareness campaigns spread. Bumper stickers appeared. The manatee stopped being invisible. Now, you've just heard about two very different forces that shaped this comeback. Hard legal enforcement on one side, and a celebrity-driven public awareness campaign on the other. Which do you think actually moved the needle more? Comment your answer below, because the answer, as it turns out, is messier and more interesting than either camp would admit. Contributing to the population boom that followed were education programs and boating speed limits that reduced collisions, rescue and rehabilitation programs, and improving access for manatees to natural springs and sanctuaries where they could avoid winter cold. In other words, it was all of it: the laws, the signs, the outreach, the rescue teams pulling injured animals from the water and nursing them back to health. The first Manatee Protection Zone rules were adopted for Martin County in 1990, and today 18 counties have Manatee Protection Zone rules. Researchers tracked individual animals using photo identification and satellite telemetry. Divers documented population health. Local fishermen, who knew these waterways better than anyone, became informal monitors, reporting injured animals, flagging dead ones, and in many cases, becoming some of the most vocal advocates for slower boats in their own backyard. The recovery wasn't linear. There were setbacks, cold snaps that killed dozens of manatees in a single winter, toxic algal blooms that poisoned entire stretches of coastline. But the trend line over decades was unmistakably upward. And then came the number that stunned people. The estimated population of 6,620 Florida manatees, recorded in 2017, was described by federal wildlife officials as a dramatic turnaround from the 1970s, when just a few hundred individuals remained. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service downlisted the West Indian manatee from endangered to threatened on the 5th of April 2017, from a few hundred animals to more than 6,000, in roughly 4 decades. The scientific community called it a conservation success. Some researchers used stronger language than that. A study by the U.S. Geological Survey and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Research Institute found that Florida's iconic manatee population was highly likely to endure for the next 100 years, so long as wildlife managers continued to protect the marine mammals and their habitat. The study estimated there was less than a 0.5% chance that either Florida's Atlantic or Gulf of Mexico manatee population could fall to as few as 500 adults, the level that could imperil long-term survival, less than 0.5%, for a species that had been counting its survivors in the hundreds. But the story doesn't end there, because just as the celebrations were starting, the water was already sending a warning. The high mortality event that struck between 2020 and 2022 was caused by starvation due to lack of forage in the Indian River Lagoon, where for over a decade, phytoplankton blooms fueled by excess nutrient loading had led to extensive seagrass losses. More than 60,000 acres of seagrass vanished overall between 2007 and 2021, an underwater meadow the size of a small city simply gone. The unusual mortality event occurred between December 2020 and April 2022, during which the unprecedented number of 1,255 manatee carcasses were documented along the Atlantic coast. The response was extraordinary. The Fish and Wildlife Service implemented a pilot supplemental feeding program in the winter of 2021 to 2022 in the Indian River Lagoon to help sustain manatees through the cold months. The supplemental feeding trial continued the following winter with over 399,000 pounds of romaine lettuce fed to the manatees at a single site. Wildlife officials, researchers, and volunteers hand-feeding lettuce to starving manatees in one of the most biodiverse lagoons in North America. It was desperate, it was heartbreaking, and it worked well enough to buy time. The unusual mortality event was administratively closed in March 2025. The elevated manatee mortality numbers associated with the event decreased, and researchers had not documented a manatee death from starvation linked to a lack of forage for 2 years. The Indian River Lagoon provides vital habitat to manatees in all seasons, and certain parts of the lagoon have exhibited remarkable seagrass recovery, likely contributing to an overall improvement in manatee body condition. The Florida population has since stabilized at between 8,350 and 11,730 animals, according to recent federal assessments. From a few hundred animals in the 1970s to a population that now numbers in the thousands, with federal scientists projecting it could potentially double over the next half-century. That is what a real conservation comeback looks like. Not a straight line, not a clean victory. A grinding, multi-decade fight won by an unlikely coalition of lawmakers, researchers, divers, fishermen, wildlife officers, and yes, one very famous singer with a thing for slow-moving sea creatures. What started as one of the most heartbreaking wildlife crises in recent memory has slowly transformed into something far more hopeful. The story unfolding across Florida's waterways shows just how powerful coordinated conservation efforts can be when communities, scientists, and government agencies unite behind a common cause. The manatee's comeback matters not just for the manatee. It matters because it proves something that conservationists have been arguing for decades, that when the right legal protections, public awareness, and on-the-ground action come together, even a species on the edge can be pulled back. The Endangered Species Act is a powerful tool for preventing extinction and helping vulnerable species recover. It is 99% effective at preventing species under its protection from going extinct. The Florida manatee is still threatened. The seagrass is still fragile. The boats are still out there. The biggest ongoing threats remain pollution, collisions with boats, and loss of habitat. But the next time you're on a Florida waterway and a no-wake sign slows you down, remember what's swimming beneath you and what it cost to keep it there. If this story of the Florida manatees' fight for survival moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to see more stories about the real battles behind the world's most remarkable conservation comebacks, subscribe, because there are more of them, and they're every bit as dramatic as this one.